Guild Wars, Sea of Sorrows. Chapter 8. The thunder of guns echoed from the cliffs surrounding the bay. The brigantine's sails flushed with wind as she tried to cut away from the Char galleon. But Sycox had been right. Even with the gale at their back, the Disinmetal couldn't escape the havoc under full steam. Kobaya stood among tents, crouched Char, their tails lashing with eagerness. Bright swords or cocked pistols grasped in their clawed fists. Battle-ready, tension thick in the air, they waited. Centurion Harrow had a grin on his furred face, fangs bared behind curled red lips. Some of the other Char spoke in low tones, voices muffled by the wind of the ship's passage and the rumble of the sea against her hull. Kobaya couldn't hear them. He wasn't even sure he wanted to know what they were saying. Every eye was fixed on their enemy. Every muscle was tensed to leap the moment their ship struck hull. "Hold our course," Harrow snarled. The cry was taken up by the Char standing closer to the engine room, carrying the call throughout the ship. The hull of the Disinmetal surged closer with each swell of water. Kobaya could see the frantic hands on board, stuffing the carronades, aware that every second brought them closer to impact with the oncoming Char vessel. One man stared at the havoc as she closed, and Kobaya could read naked fear on the man's features. The havoc closed to pistol range, 20 yards. Half pistol range. Small arms fire exploded from the human ship, and the Char crouched in preparedness. Kobaya imagined what it must be like to see a ship full of ferocious Char bearing down on you. Only a few feet of water separating you from claws and teeth. The havoc grew closer and closer still, and the humans desperately fired their pistols and tried to load their carronades. But they weren't fast enough with the ship's guns, and the Disinmetal had run out of time. The Char helmsman let out a mighty bellow as the havoc plowed bow first into the brigantine's side. Although Kobaya was braced for impact, the collision knocked his feet out from under him, slamming him forward into the guardrail. He grunted, trying to right himself, and realized he was the only one lying down. Each of the Char had their claws sunk deep into the oak. As Kobaya scrabbled to rise, the sailors of the Havoc leapt over the rail in massive leonine pounces and landed on the deck of the Disinmetal. The gun crew of the brigantine flung themselves at the Char in response, drawing swords and knives from their belts. Battle cries rose above the clash of steel on steel. Even old Grist, who was not as fast as the others, fought with a fury that Kobaya had never seen before in war. If this was what Char brought to the field of battle, it was little wonder that Ascalon had been lost. At their furious charge, the deck of the Disinmetal erupted in confusion. Huge furred Char swept down upon their enemy, swords flashing viciously. Claws slashed here and there, cutting through the human ship's ropes, tearing down their sails. Pistols fired, puffs of smoke erupting into the air, and, once empty, were shoved back into their holsters. There was no time to pack and reload. The havoc struck her enemy relentlessly, driving the thick limb of her bow into the Disinmetal's hull. Both ships had suffered damage. The Havoc's hull was cracked, the sturdy boards separated in small breaches. They could be tarred back together, the water in her berth eased out by bilge pumps. The Disinmetal had not been so lucky. Her side was caved, her sleek curve wrenched apart, and water was pouring into her berth. She'd survive, but only if she could dislodge her unwanted suitor and plug the rent he'd made in her corseted hull. Kobaya pulled himself to his feet and climbed over the rail. With a gulp, he steeled himself and stared across the divide between the Havoc and the enemy brigantine. Gripping the belaying pin tightly in his hand, he leapt. 3, 2, 1, then he slammed into the brigantine's deck, rolling across the slippery surface with the force of his impact. Within seconds of his feet striking the wood of the Disinmetal's deck, someone attacked him. A fist drove into his cheekbone, knocking him sideways over a carronade. A sword swept over his head, clipping his hair and drawing blood from the edge of his ear. Spinning in his crouch, he plowed the belaying pin into the side of the other man's knee and saw him fall forward with a stiff crack of bone. The sailor swung again, but Kobaya parried his sword with the thick oak of the pin. He returned the blow and drove his belaying pin into the man's gut. The dismembered sailor dropped his sword, howling with pain as Kobaya cracked him across the face and kicked him over, watching as the sailor collapsed into unconsciousness. Just then one of the char stormed past, burying a heavy-bladed axe into the sailor's back. "Well done," snarled the helmsman. "And here I'd bet 3 gold you weren't really on our side." He laughed, and the sound was bloodthirsty. "Perhaps you're worthwhile after all, Mouse." "You didn't have to kill him, Fasher," Kobaya choked. "He was out of the fight." Pulling his weapon free and sighting his next prey across the ship, Fasher shrugged. "Now he's out of the world." Without another word, the burly char sprang across the ship toward another human sailor. Galled, Kobaya faltered and ventured to the rear of the ship, avoiding fights wherever he could. All around him, char and humans were locked in vicious struggles, and the char didn't fight fair. They took no prisoners. They exploited weakness and ground it into dust. Although badly outnumbered, they were clearly the more seasoned warriors, fighting in small clusters of 2 or 3 against groups twice, even 3 times, their size. Kobaya had never seen such glee in the eyes of combatants. It sickened him. Even Shar, who had shown him common courtesy on board the Havoc, now fought with joyous abandon, seemingly unaware, or uncaring, that their prey were terrified and overwhelmed. The sailors, convinced that the char would never surrender, returned hate with fury, killing any char they found alone. The longer the conflict progressed, the more people on both sides would die. The only way to stop the killing was to end the fight as quickly as possible. Kobaya hurdled a hatch to reach the brigantine's quarterdeck, dodging through 2 shouting sailors as he broke into a run. The deck was slippery with blood and salt water, but he did have one advantage, for the most part. The pirates of the Dismembered ignored anything furless. On the quarterdeck, 4 burly sailors manned the bombard. One hefted a pair of burlap gunpowder sacks into the barrel, and 2 more were working to lift a massive iron cannonball. The 4th stood at the top of the stairs to the deck, a loaded pistol in each hand, 2 more stuffed through his belt, and a cutlass in a sheath at his side. Right now, the armed thug was watching the strife with a patient, ready eye, weighting the pistols in his hands. His forehead wrinkled in a frown as he watched Kobaya approach. Clearly, he couldn't place the youth among the crew. Using that to his advantage, Kobaya pretended to stumble on his way up the last few stairs. "Sir," he said. "The captain says." Then, at the last moment, instead of straightening, Kobaya charged forward and buried his shoulder in the thug's midsection. To Kobaya's surprise, the big man didn't go down. Although Kobaya's shoulder hit him solidly, eliciting a meager grunt, the man stood his ground at the top of the stairs as if he were a brick wall. Kobaya looked up over his shoulder at the immense man's broad, pie-like face and managed a half-hearted smile. The pistol in the sailor's right hand slammed down onto Kobaya's back with terrific force, missing his temple by inches. A second motion, and the handle of the other pistol crashed into his collarbone with enough force to knock Kobaya to his knees. As Kobaya lay there, his head spinning, the big thug raised his pistols and cocked the hammers back in slow motion. Staring down twin columns of doom, Kobaya tried to murmur a prayer to the god of death. He couldn't finish it. Instead, he whispered his sister's name. The roar that followed wasn't one of flame and gunpowder, or the crashing impact of iron ball against bone. Instead, something fuzzy smacked Kobaya's cheek, a tail, as a large rust-colored mountain of muscle tore up the stairs and launched itself at the sailor. "Psychox?" Kobaya said, marveling. One of the thug's guns went off as Sycox plowed into him. An iron ball whizzed past, sinking deep into the oak deck a few inches from Kobaya's feet. Unlike the slender Kobaya, Sycox had more than twice the mass of the thug, and the two toppled and rolled onto the deck like a cat with a ball of yarn. "Get the others, Kobe," Sycox roared. "Stop them before they point that thrice-burned thing at our ship." Startled, Kobaya pushed himself to his feet, looking past the brawlers. The other sailors on the quarterdeck were rushing about in a panic, trying to get the gun readied. They shoved a watermelon-sized cannonball into the gun's barrel, and one tamped it down with a long, padded stick, while another unscrewed the cover of the vent tube and frantically shoved a friction primer down into the hole. One tug on the lanyard sticking out of the thin hole in the breech of the cannon, and the heavy gun would fire. As Kobaya watched, the third man drew a cutlass from his belt and strode murderously toward him. Still holding the belaying pin, Kobaya stepped forward to fight. The dismembered sailor took the first swing. His blade swished forward, and Kobaya dodged nimbly. With a shrug of his shoulders, the youth returned the favor, swinging the belaying pin widely in the hopes of ending the fight in a single shot. The sailor ducked easily and grinned, revealing 4 gold teeth. With a snatch of his free hand, he gripped Kobaya's wrist as it passed, twisting viciously. Pain racked Kobaya's arm as the belaying pin slid through numb fingers. When it struck the deck, the sailor kicked it away, laughing at Kobaya's grimace of pain. Kobaya tried a shallow kick at his enemy's leg, but the other man dodged it, keeping hold of Kobaya's arm. Kobaya rolled closer, under sword range, pressing his back against the sailor's chest. Recklessly, he drove his free elbow into the sailor's ribcage and was rewarded by a whoosh of air, and the soldier's grasp loosening on Kobaya's wrist. Tilting his forearm back, Kobaya slammed his fist upward. Bone cracked as his knuckles creased the man's lower jaw. Nearby, Sycox fought far more warily. "You're big," he said, circling the massive thug who had guarded the stairwell. The mountainous sailor turned slowly, keeping his eyes on the canny char. His hands spread wide, he waited for the inevitable rush. But Sycox only smiled and stepped again to the side. "You'll find no opening, kitty," the big human bellowed. "I fought your kind before. I was raised in Ascalon. I used char hides as hearth rugs." He drew a deep breath, bald pate shining in the sunlight. "I'll tear out your claws and carve 'em into scrimshaw." Sycox lashed his tail, feinting left and right. He'd already gotten several blows in, marking his burly opponent with bloody streaks down chest and arms. But it hadn't been enough to slow the sailor's motions. The Shar managed to turn the sailor away from the stairs. Narrowing his eyes, Sycox measured his opponent with a snarl. The thug was nearly as tall as the tawny char, and even wider through the chest. "Do you think I'm weak?" the thug taunted. "Stop stalling. I'm ready for you, Char." "You may be ready for him," a reedy voice piped up from over the side of the ship. Matcha stood on the railing of the Havoc, her feathered armbands and embroidered blue robe whipping in the strong wind. "But you're definitely not ready for me." A brilliant spell flowed from the Asura's fingertips, leaping through the air in fractal twists and unpredictable patterns. In one hand she held a short scepter, and from the other poured a wild burst of magic. Serpents formed of brilliant, glittering points of light swarmed forward, writhing one over the other, as each fought to reach their target first. "Pain!" the Asura shouted. Her twisting barrage pummeled into the sailor's broad chest. "Anguish," Matcha pointed again, and the snakes lashed out around his body, their glittering viperous heads striking the sailor again and again. "Ruin," the final word of her spell hissed out between the Asura's gritted teeth. Overwhelmed by agony, the dismembered thug toppled to the ground with a shriek of pain. He thrashed violently as spectral serpents coiled about his torso, piercing his flesh repeatedly with their poisonous, sparkling fangs. Kobaya had never seen the like. "I thought you said you couldn't blast them with magic," Sycox yelped, smacking at his arm where a spark of passing starlight had set fire to the fur. Matcha tossed her head, rainbow braids flying. "No, I said it was a stupid question." Across the deck, Kobaya's assailant staggered back as the youth planted another uppercut beneath his jaw. Bewildered by the concussion, the sailor shook his head and tried to clear his thoughts, only to have Kobaya slip out of his grasp. He shook his pale hair out of his eyes and launched 2 quick punches. They landed with rock-hard thuds, and the staggering pirate tumbled to the deck. Is it out? Is the fire out?" Panicked, Sycox smacked desperately at the singed area on his arm. Kobaya grabbed him, smothering the last of the flame with the sleeve of his shirt. He couldn't help laughing at the agitation on the powerful creature's face. "What?" Sycox moaned. "Fur is flammable." Laughing, Kobaya clapped him on the shoulder with a wide grin. Is it out? Is the fire out?" Panicked, Sycox smacked desperately at the singed area on his arm. Kobaya grabbed him, smothering the last of the flame with the sleeve of his shirt. He couldn't help laughing at the agitation on the powerful creature's face. "What?" Sycox moaned. "Fur is flammable." Laughing, Kobaya clapped him on the shoulder with a wide grin. "Get to the weapon, you idiots." From the railing of the Havoc, Matcha thrust her finger demandingly toward the other sailors on the quarterdeck. "Stop fooling around." Sycox rolled his eyes. "The woman sets me alight and then accuses me of wasting time. Completely unfair." 5 yards away, the last 2 sailors worked frantically to maneuver the now loaded battery gun into place. One spun a wheel at its base, turning the cannon on its harness, while the other desperately shoved at the barrel with all his strength. They'd turned it almost a full 90 degrees. Now, the swell of its huge muzzle pointed toward the Havoc's hull. On the main deck, Shar and human sailors fought viciously. Several on both sides had fallen, and the deck was stained red with blood. A few of the humans had broken free of their cat-like foes, and now struggled over the side of the Disenmetal, using heavy crowbars and thick oak staves in an attempt to dislodge the Char vessel. They hacked at the Havoc's hull in a reckless frenzy. As they did, a few of the Char remaining on the Havoc shot pistols at them, glad to join in the fight. Madness everywhere. Kobaya could see Centurion Harrow fighting back-to-back with a wounded Fashur near the Disenmetal's central mast. The captain's white fur was stained with oil and gunpowder, and one arm hung limply by his side. Leaning wearily against the mast, he kicked an adversary in the knee with his heavy peg leg, unloading his pistol at the human at the same time. Fasher was doing less well. Labored breathing aggravated a long, deep gash on his chest where his pelt was matted with blood. Yet the Char was not giving up. With each gasp of air, he swung his sword again, driving back the mass of humans that threatened to overwhelm the captain and his loyal second. "Sycox!" Kobaya yelled. "I'll man the cannon if you handle the sailors." Pausing, he added, "But don't kill them." "Don't kill? Pish. You humans are so binary," growled the Char, but his snarl twisted into a smile. "I should have left you in the ocean." With a bound, he lunged toward the frantic humans. Claws outstretched, mouth open, fangs wide and threatening, the engineer vented his fury on the 2 humans with gleeful abandon. He was as fast as a jungle cat and more than their match. In moments, they'd both been knocked senseless. Long claw marks on their faces and chests offered tribute to the tawny Char's precision. While Sycox was handling the threat, Kobaya raced to the rear of the massive bombard. The vent was open but unlit, and down the narrow channel he could smell gunpowder and oil. Cotton fiber hung limply from the chamber, a thread that drove down the vent into the darkness where the charge had been packed inside the bowl of the barrel's deepest recess. One flame, even one small spark, and the vent's wick would catch. If that happened, the bombard would suck a breath of fire into the depths of its belly, where sacks of black powder were waiting for just such a kiss. After that, all hell would break loose. "What are you waiting for?" A whisper, high-pitched and snarky, resounded magically in Kobia's ear. Startled, he blinked and looked around. Matcha stood on the Havoc's railing, across the divide between the ships. She glowered at him, activating her vocal illusion again. "Turn the gun and fire." Kobaya reached down and cranked the handle that turned the bombard. Rolling it in its tight circle, he swung the barrel away from the char ship and rocked it sharply to the right. A piece of tarred wood rested in a metal bucket beside the bombard, sparks popping and flames flickering along its end. One touch of that flame, and the cannon would fire. He planned to clear the Disenmaidal's deck, point the weapon into the open waters of Lion's Arches Bay. Perhaps he would have, if the path of the barrel hadn't crossed over the brigantine's deck. Staring out over the battle, Kobaya took stock of it. The Shar captain had fallen. He lay unmoving on the Disenmaidal's scarlet-washed deck, surrounded by his conquered foes. Fashur was still fighting despite his terrible wound. If anything, the dark-furred Char's energy had been renewed with the fall of his centurion. Roaring in grief and anger, he lashed out at anything that came too close. Beyond him, a small knot of bloodied humans readied themselves for an assault. They might have been planning to murder the Shar and take their ship, or simply drive the enemy from their decks and push back the Havoc's prow. They might have been planning to die in battle, throwing themselves on their foe until one or both were eradicated. And suddenly, with a fire that rivaled the Havoc's massive furnace, Kobaya realized he was angry. The Shar were killing his countrymen. The humans were killing his crew. With a wave of possessiveness, Kobaya realized that he had to protect them. All of them. He hadn't foreseen his next actions. He didn't plan them. Some slight shift in thinking altered his course, changing his intentions as fluidly as the wind altered the canvas of a ship's sail. With the bombard pointed at the center of the Disenmaidal's deck, Kobaya raised his voice and bellowed. "No more killing." Kobaya shouted the words so loudly that the hair on the back of his arms stood up. Even Psychox, guarding the stairwell between the main deck and the foredeck, bristled and stood still. Even with that, the two crews probably wouldn't have stopped fighting if they hadn't suddenly realized they were staring down the muzzle of a bombast cannon. As it was, the freeze crept over the ship like a winter frost whispering along the shoreline. Both Shar and human alike turned to stare up at the youth angling the cannon's mouth directly into the belly of the Disenmaidal. Yet again, Kobaya was leaping into action without thinking of the consequences, just as he had with Tosh. But this time, there was a lot more on the line than just pride. "Wake up, you fools. Look at what you're doing," Kobaya roared. "You're killing each other for no reason. Why? For glory? For gold? For the legions? Out of loyalty to a king who might not even exist anymore? Or because that's what the Char and the humans have always done?" With a snarl worthy of a Char, Kobaya roared to Grenth's realms of torment with the past. The past is dead. 10,000 gallons of ocean just wiped it from the shoreline, along with the greatest city in Kryta. And all you want to do is kill each other? Kobaya felt his face grow hot, his eyes filling with acrid tears in the wake of his anger. "Put your weapons down." Across the Disenmaidal, realization dawned over the combatants. The huge cannon was pointed down at them, primed and ready to fire. None of them, Shar or human, could reach Kobaya before he could ignite the weapon. Uncertain and unwilling to let go of their weapons, the warring crews nevertheless stepped back from one another in slow realization of their situation. The brigantine was badly damaged, her hull pierced by the nose of the Char galleon. The Havoc was also in danger. Despite the efforts of the human sailors, its nose remained firmly lodged. If the Disinmatal sank into the waves, she would take her char suitor as well. "You have 3 minutes to abandon this ship and get on board the Havoc," Kobaya yelled. "We're bound for Port Stalwart. The Shar won't hurt you. They've lost enough sailors in the storm, and this fight, that they can't even crew their own ship anymore." "What?" Fesser yelled. "Take these pirates on board?" "We're not pirates," one of the human sailors shouted resoundingly. "We were 2 days out of Lion's Arch when the wave threw us back and crashed us against the cliffs. We fixed her as best we could and were trying to guard the wreckage, to look for survivors. When we saw your vessel, we thought you'd come to attack, that maybe the wave was caused by Shar weaponry." His voice faltered in a chorus of muttered agreement from the sailors of the Disinmatal. The Shar crewmen snarled disapprovingly, but none raised A in the face of Kobaya's bombast. "None of us are responsible for the wave," Kobaya said. "I can promise you that. It came from R. I can tell you this wasn't some new char weapon. It also wasn't an accident, or a storm, or a natural disaster. I was there when it happened." Kobaya struggled with his memories as he spoke, trying to force the jumbled recollection into something resembling a sane account of the images he'd seen. "I saw beyond the wave. I saw land in the middle of the Sea of Sorrows. A drowned city erupting from the waves. Not just buildings, but mountains, shorelines, plains of rock and coral. They'd all been ripped up from the depths. I saw ore rise, and I saw the thing that did it." Kobaya gripped the cannon with white-knuckled hands as both crews stared at him, aghast. "I don't know what kind of creature it was, but it was big, bigger than any ship, like a mountain of rotted flesh and shattered bone. When that thing out there raised its wings, the very earth trembled and rose beneath it. The sea parted and the wave of its awakening swept over us." Kobaya paused to wipe the tears from his eyes. "Now, you listen, and listen good. We are going to work together. We're going to sail together, and we're going to survive together. Otherwise, we're all going to die." He took a deep breath and growled down at them, as fierce as one of the char. "Neither of these ships will make it on their own. So we're going to do it as one crew, like it or not. Everyone get aboard the Havoc. We're headed for Port Stalwart. Once there, you can stay or go as you like, and may Dwayna keep your sorry hides." Both crews looked back and forth at one another, swords still drawn and pistols ready, only a breath away from falling back into the fight. "Are you sure about this?" Sycox muttered up at him. He crouched on the stairs, ears back, arms wide, and claws extended in a ferocious pose. "Don't look at me." Kobaya gave him a thin-lipped smile. "This was your idea." "Mine?" The char glared. "You started this when you saved me." Kobaya gripped the torch over the cannon's back so that everyone could see it. "Now I've got to save them." A thin veneer of fire trickled over the tip, illuminating the dark tar there with eager, hungry flame. Holding it a few inches above the vent at the cannon's breech, Kobaya fixed them all with a cold stare. "You're killing each other because this is the enemy you know," Kobaya bellowed. "But the enemy you don't know just wiped out the city of Lion's Arch without even trying. It raised an entire city from the ocean floor, and that's just for starters. Are you going to waste your time tearing each other apart just for old time's sake?" "Why should we believe you?" asked the helmsman of the Havoc, his black fur tinged with blood. Uncompromising, Kobaya met Fasser's skeptical stare. "Believe me or not, but something made that wave. Whatever it was, it destroyed the Shar harbor to the south, and killed all your friends there as well as the humans in Lion's Arch." Kobaya faced the human sailors with the same defiance. "Clearly, it doesn't care if you're char or human, or Asura, or anything else. Do you think you can fight it alone? Do you?" The two crews stared at him in shock. Kobaya continued. "Now, I don't know what that creature was, but I'm going to give you the same choice it did. Kobaya positioned the torch within an inch of the bombard's fuse vent. "Work together," Kobaya said, challenging them, "or die together." The ocean lapped hungrily against the ship's side, echoing in the silence that followed Kobaya's speech. He watched many sets of eyes flicker toward the line of dark storm clouds hovering on the distant southern horizon. Even the brash Fasher quietly lowered his sword. "I'm glad you understand me. Now get moving." Slowly, Kobaya moved the flame toward the bombast's wick. "You've got 3 seconds." Roused to motion, the sailors of both ships scattered, racing from the deck of the Disenmeadle. Fasher and Psychox snapped orders to human and Char alike, commanding them to grab anything that could be scavenged from the failing brigantine. Kobaya smiled, one hand slipping to touch the rag doll at his belt. "I'm going to save them, Bivy," he whispered. "All of them. Bold move." The Asura's illusory words hummed in Kobaya's ear, startling him. "But what makes you think any of them will listen once the bombard's gone?" "It's 6 days to Port Stalwart, if the Havoc can weather it. She's damaged, and she needs a full crew. This is the only way for any of them to survive." Kobaya wasn't sure Matcha's spell let her hear as well as speak, but it didn't matter. "I'll make them listen. I won't let anything happen to these sailors. Not while they're under my watch. Trust me." Kobaya smiled and lit the fuse,